hold you up to.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Willie Geist.
Good morning. We're coming on the air with breaking news. NBC News has learned the first Israeli hostages, 3 women, have just been released by Hamas after nearly 16 months in captivity. The Israeli military says the hostages were handed over to the Red Cross just moments ago. Their freedom coming as part of a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas that went into effect this morning after a brief delay. Today's news marks the beginning of the first of 3 phases of the ceasefire deal, with each phase set to last several weeks. With phase 1 now underway, hostages are set to be released every 7 days until 33 have been freed, though it remains unclear right now if all of them are alive. For their part, the Israeli government will release dozens of Palestinian prisoners and send fresh aid into Gaza, with the fighting there now on hold. NBC's chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is in Tel Aviv following this closely with us. Richard, what more can you tell us about this release of those 3 hostages?
So hopefully you can hear me. There is a lot of music here. There are celebrations going on here in Tel Aviv in what is called Hostage Square now. Yes, we can confirm from the Israeli military, from our sources in Gaza, that this transfer took place. It took place in Gaza City. There was a strong contingent of Hamas militants. They arrived masked, they arrived armed, they arrived in vehicles. Then they handed over to the Red Crescent those 3 female hostages, Romi Gonen, Doron Steinbecher, and Emily Damari. They were handed over to the Red Cross. The Red Cross then taking them to the Israeli military. They were greeted once inside Israel by their mothers, and then they will be flown. This process is underway right now to Tel Aviv, where they will receive medical treatment. So we can confirm that the process is still underway, but that they are now inside Israeli territory. So the first hostage transfer has been successful of this long process.
And, of course, long awaited for those mothers, greeting the 3 young women ranging in age from 24 to 31. Do we know anything at this early stage, Richard, about the health of the 3 hostages who are now free?
They were all walking. We didn't get very many images of them. There had been some expectation that at least one of these young women would be potentially in a wheelchair. All of them seemed to be, at least at a first glance, to be in relatively good condition. Romi Gonin, as you mentioned, 24 years old. We have spoken over the process over this last 15 months with her family, with her mother. Her mother was there, Mirav, at the site to receive her once they crossed into Israel. She was kidnapped from the Nova Music Festival. She had been shot during her kidnapping, so she will clearly need medical condition. All of them will need medical condition. That's why they're being brought to a hospital here. The Israeli military has put both medical personnel on standby as well as psychological support. Doron Steinbecher from Kfar Aza, which is a kibbutz right on the border with Gaza. She was kidnapped from her home. She's a 31-year-old veterinary nurse known in her community as someone who always worked with animals, loved animals. And then Emily Damari, also kidnapped from her home in Kfar Aza, a 28-year-old described as a very popular member of the community, someone who loved barbecues, organizing social events, and now with their mothers on their way to medical treatment here in Tel Aviv.
And it has been nearly 16 months, as I mentioned, since the terrorist attack of October 7th that those 3 young women and many others have been in captivity. So, Richard, let's look at now what happens from here. As those hostages are cared for, Israelis looking forward to the release of 30 more in the coming weeks. What else will happen today on the other side of this deal?
So on the other side of the deal, as soon as this happens, first of all, in order to allow this to happen, the ceasefire went into effect several hours ago. So that means Israeli strikes on Gaza stopped, or at least paused for now, because Israel has said that it reserves the right to resume strikes on Gaza should this deal break down. So the ceasefire went into effect, so major military operations have at least been paused. The hostages, these first 3, have been transferred to Israel. This allows the process to continue. Aid trucks have been lining up on the edge of Gaza in order to bring more humanitarian relief to the 2.3 million people of Gaza. Also, this initiates the first stage of prisoner releases, and families in Gaza have been waiting, preparing their homes to receive their loved ones. Then the next phase of this process begins, which is preparations for the next batch of hostages. And as of now, that is supposed to take place in 1 week's time. And the expectation at this moment is that 4 more hostages will be released, also potentially 4 more women.
Richard Engel reporting from Tel Aviv this morning as 3 Israeli hostages now are with their families and undergoing medical evaluation and treatment inside Israel. Richard, thanks so much. Let's bring in NBC News contributor Jeremy Bash. He's a former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. Jerry, good morning. Jeremy, this was a fragile deal right up until this morning when there was a delay in the implementation of this prisoner exchange, of the return of the hostages from Hamas into Israel. What do you make of what we've seen so far?
Well, it's emotional. Obviously, there's incredible relief for the families, but it remains fragile, Willie, because if you examine the text of this carefully negotiated agreement between Hamas and between Israel, which the United States, the Biden administration, together with the incoming Trump team and the Qataris and the Egyptians had to hammer out over these last several weeks. The agreement means that 3 living hostages will come out today, the 3 women that Richard was just speaking about. And then there's a waiting period. And then on day 7, 4 additional living women are going to be released. And then at that time, Hamas will give Israel the total list of the initial 33 hostages who will come out in phase 1 over 42 days. Among those 33, we expect 2 Americans to be released. Keith Siegel, 65 years old, and Sagi Dek El-Chen, 36-year-old father of 3. There's a 3rd living American hostages, military-age male, Idana Alexander. He's not on the initial list, and there's concern that he will be held until a later phase because of his status as a, quote, healthy military-age male, if you can speak of someone in good health after 470 days in captivity. So 3 living Americans, and then the remains of 4 Americans who were murdered. Omer Nutra, Itai Chen, Gad and Judy Hagai. Those also need to be repatriated with their families until we can say all Americans, Willie, are home.
All right, Jeremy Bash, we appreciate your insight into this deal. Thanks so much. Meanwhile, both President Biden and President-elect Trump have been watching today's movements very closely, of course. Let's bring in Aaron Gilchrist at the White House with more on that. Aaron, what are you hearing?
Willie, good morning. We expect to hear from President Biden in the next few minutes here. The White House was scheduled a speech, remarks from him for 10:30 this morning. As he was leaving Washington, D.C., I can tell you he just landed in Charleston, South Carolina, where he's expected to speak at a church at the top of the hour. These remarks about this ceasefire deal and hostage release deal actually coming to fruition are remarks that were added to be before this speech that he's supposed to give at a church today. Of course, we know the Biden administration has been working for the better part of a year to bring together a deal that would result in the release of hostages and a stop to the fighting in Gaza. This is something that the president has spoken about over the last several days, being happy that this deal has finally come together. He reminded us that he put forth a proposal back in May of last year, and that the deal that ultimately came together last week was essentially the deal that he had put on the table in May of last year. And his team has been on the ground over the last several weeks trying to finalize this deal that ultimately really came together finally over the weekend, last weekend, and is now, as we've been seeing, Willie, being implemented today. We expect to hear from President Biden hopefully in the next half hour.
Yeah, we expect to hear from him a short time from now what could be his last public remarks as President of the United States, as Donald Trump will be inaugurated for a second time just over 24 hours from now. Aaron Gilchrist at the White House, thank you so much. Again, those 3 Israeli hostages now released, receiving medical treatment. Good news there. This has been an NBC News special report. You can see much more throughout the day on NBCnews.com and NBC Nightly News.